I sat perfectly still as 12 hands went up into the air. My mother-in-law had just asked our entire extended family to vote on whether I should be permanently banned from the family. They all voted yes. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just looked at the lavish dining room around us, a room paid for by the very restaurant empire I secretly owned. Before I tell you how I legally evicted them from their own lives just 7 days later, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic in-laws exactly who holds the real power. I am Maya, 34 years old, and a corporate crisis manager based in Atlanta. I spend my days dismantling hostile takeovers, handling public relations disasters, and negotiating multi-million-dollar settlements. I am trained to remain absolutely calm when everything around me is burning to the ground. But nothing in my professional career could have prepared me for the emotional ambush waiting for me at the Caldwell family estate in Buckhead. It was Thanksgiving Day. The sprawling brick mansion was suffocatingly warm, filled with the rich scents of roasted turkey collard greens and candied yams. It had been exactly 2 years since my husband Marcus passed away in a tragic car accident. This was the first major holiday I had agreed to spend with his family since his funeral. I only came because I wanted to keep his memory alive for our young son, but sitting at that massive mahogany dining table, I quickly realized I had walked into a highly coordinated trap. The Caldwell family was basically royalty in our local community. They were the proud owners of Caldwell's Heritage, an upscale soul food restaurant chain that had been a staple in Atlanta for decades. My mother-in-law, Beatrice Caldwell, built her entire identity on being the powerful matriarch of that business and a highly respected pillar of her mega church. To the outside world, she was a devout, generous, and loving woman. But behind closed doors, Beatrice was a master manipulator who ruled her family through financial control and emotional intimidation. From the day Marcus brought me home, Beatrice made it clear I was an outsider. I did not come from their prestigious social circles. I wore tailored silk suits instead of extravagant church hats, and I prioritized my independent career over joining the family restaurant business. Marcus was her golden child, and she deeply resented that he chose a woman who refused to bow to her authority. When he died, the invisible thread tying me to her grace snapped entirely. The dinner had been tense from the start. I sat near the middle of the long table, quietly cutting my food while listening to the forced, superficial chatter. Beatrice sat at the head of the table wearing a burgundy silk dress, her signature pearl necklace gleaming under the crystal chandelier. She spent the first hour of the meal holding court, boasting to the extended family about her latest church donations and the supposed record-breaking profits of the restaurants. I knew the actual financial numbers of her business were a disaster, but I kept my mouth shut and focused on my plate. We had just finished the main course when the atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. The low hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Beatrice reached out with a manicured hand and picked up her silver fork. She tapped it sharply against her crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound cut through the room like a siren. Everyone froze. The cheerful chatter of my aunts, uncles, and cousins died down instantly. Beatrice cleared her throat and stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. The look she gave me was a chilling combination of absolute triumph and deep-seated disdain. Family, she began, her voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a seasoned preacher. Thanksgiving is a time for gratitude. It is a time to reflect on our blessings and thank the Lord for keeping us together. But it is also a time to protect the sanctity of our traditions. She paused, letting the silence stretch out, making sure every single eye in the room was fixed on her. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts as a crisis manager kicked in, warning me that a targeted attack was underway. Since my beloved son Marcus went to be with the Lord, the dynamic at this table has shifted drastically. Beatrice continued, her voice taking on a sorrowful, dramatic tone. We have all tried our hardest to embrace his widow. We have extended grace. We have offered our prayers. But Maya has grown cold. She does not participate in our church fundraisers. She actively avoids our Sunday dinners. And quite frankly, her blatant disrespect for how this family operates is casting a dark, toxic cloud over our gatherings. I sat perfectly still, my face a carefully blank mask. I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The audacity of her words was breathtaking. I had skipped her Sunday dinners because they always devolved into interrogations about my finances and unsolicited critiques of my parenting. I skipped her church fundraisers because she only used them as photo opportunities to show off her wealth to the congregation. It is clear to me and to many of you who have spoken to me in private that Maya no longer wishes to honor the Caldwell name Beatrice proclaimed, raising her chin. She operates as if she is above us, as if the very family that welcomed her is now beneath her notice. We cannot allow this negative energy to poison our family legacy. We must protect our peace and preserve the joy of our household. She took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with pure malice. Therefore, for the emotional well-being of this family, I am calling for a formal family vote. I propose that Maya be officially and permanently excluded from all future Caldwell events, holidays, and family matters. The words hung in the warm, food-scented air. It was a direct public execution of my place in the family. I did not gasp. I did not defend myself. I did not beg for an explanation. I just looked around the table waiting to see who would be brave enough to speak up against this absolute madness. Instead of objections, I watched a horrific display of loyalty to the Caldwell wealth. One by one, hands began to go up into the air. Beatrice raised her hand first, holding it high and proud. Then, my sister-in-law Jasmine raised hers. Her lips curled into a nasty, satisfied smirk. This was a woman whose designer handbag I had personally paid off just 6 months ago to save her from a collection agency. Next to her, aunts and cousins slowly raised their hands. These were the same relatives I had hosted at my own home, the same people who had smiled in my face and hugged me when I walked through the door just 2 hours earlier. I watched 12 hands raise high above the dining table, 12 people voting to completely erase me from the family. The room was dead silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The tension was so thick it felt hard to breathe. They were all staring at me, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to shout, waiting for me to give them the angry, defensive reaction that would justify their cruelty. But I simply sat there, absorbing the ultimate betrayal, my mind already calculating my next move. The silence that followed the raising of those 12 hands was heavy and suffocating. No one dared to breathe. I kept my posture rigid and my expression entirely unreadable. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I simply sat there absorbing the ultimate betrayal, my mind already calculating my next move. Then the oppressive silence was broken by Connor. He slowly lowered his hand and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the fine lace tablecloth. Connor was Jasmine's husband, a white man who had moved into the Caldwell family orbit 5 years ago and essentially never left. He was a master of using progressive modern therapy language to mask his absolute entitlement and profound laziness. He wore a trendy linen shirt and a carefully trimmed beard, adopting a look of deep performative empathy that made my stomach churn. "Maya, you have to understand where we are coming from." Connor began, his voice soft and patronizing. He clasped his hands together as if he were guiding a group meditation rather than participating in the public excommunication of his sister-in-law. "We are all on a healing journey here. Losing Marcus was incredibly traumatizing for this entire family, and we have been trying to navigate that grief together. But your energy lately has just been incredibly toxic." I did not blink. I let him keep talking mentally, adding his words to the long list of debts this family was about to repay. "You have isolated yourself," he continued, shaking his head sadly. "You did not allow us to hold space for your mourning. Instead, you threw yourself into your career. We are really trying to cultivate a safe space for healing and generational wealth building within the Caldwell family. Your toxic independence is a trigger for us. It creates a hostile environment." You refuse to rely on the family structure and it makes everyone feel undervalued. We just need to protect our peace. Generational wealth building. The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. Connor had not held a steady job in 3 years. He spent his days pitching failed startup ideas while living rent-free in a townhouse owned by Beatrice. The audacity of this man lecturing me about wealth building while eating a turkey, paid for by my silent financial interventions, was staggering. Jasmine immediately jumped in to back up her husband. She nodded vigorously, her heavy gold bangles clanking loudly against the wooden table. Exactly, she chimed in, pointing a manicured acrylic nail in my direction. You act like you are better than us, just because you run your little corporate consulting firm downtown. You think because you wear expensive suits and mingle with executives that you can look down your nose at our traditions. Jasmine's face twisted with a bitter, visceral jealousy that had been brewing since the day Marcus first introduced me to the family. You are a widow, Maya. She spat, her voice growing louder and more aggressive. You should be leaning on us. You should be seeking our guidance. Instead, you walk around acting like you run the world. You make everyone in this house uncomfortable because you refuse to play your part. You think you are untouchable, but you forget that you are only sitting at this table because my brother fell in love with you. Without Marcus, you are just a guest who overstayed her welcome. I stared at Jasmine. My expression remained stone cold, but inside a furious fire was beginning to burn. I stared at this woman who lived entirely for social media validation. I knew for a fact that her credit cards regularly declined at local grocery stores. I knew because I was the one who had quietly written a check to stop her luxury SUV from being repossessed just 6 months ago. I did it to protect my late husband's family name, keeping her embarrassing financial ruin a secret from the very aunts and uncles sitting around this table. Yet here she was, aggressively lecturing me about family roles and my supposed arrogance. The sheer hypocrisy in the room was suffocating. I looked past Jasmine and Connor, scanning the faces of the extended relatives. My aunts and uncles, people who had gladly accepted my financial help, my gifts and my hospitality over the years, now sat with their eyes averted. They stared at their plates, too cowardly to speak up against Beatrice, too comfortable in their complicity. They had traded their loyalty for Beatrice's approval, completely unaware that Beatrice's empire was a hollow shell. I was fully prepared to sit through the rest of this pathetic display in silence. I was prepared to let them finish their self-righteous speeches, gather my things, and quietly walk out the door. I had dealt with hostile boardrooms and ruthless corporate raiders. A dining table full of delusional narcissists was nothing I could not handle. But then a small trembling hand tugged urgently at the sleeve of my silk blazer. I turned my head and looked down at my son. Leo was 8 years old, a brilliant, sensitive boy who looked so much like his father that it sometimes made my heart ache. He had been sitting quietly beside me this entire time, obediently eating his dinner. Now his fork lay abandoned on his plate. His big brown eyes were wide with confusion, fear, and profound hurt. His lower lip quivered uncontrollably, and heavy tears were spilling down his cheeks, dropping onto the collar of his crisp white shirt. He did not understand the complex web of financial control and jealousy that ruled his grandmother's actions, but he understood exactly what it meant when an entire room full of people raised their hands against his mother. "Mom." Leo sobbed, his voice cracking. The sound pierced through the heavy tension in the dining room. Why are they doing this? Why does Grandma hate us? My heart shattered. The cold, calculated armor I wore for my profession instantly melted away, replaced by the fierce, protective instinct of a mother. I reached out and pulled him against my side, wrapping my arms securely around his small, shaking shoulders. I kissed the top of his head, murmuring softly to calm him, doing my best to shield him from the toxic energy radiating from the people across the table. The sound of a grieving child crying should have invoked at least some level of basic human compassion. It should have shamed them. It should have made Beatrice realize that her cruel power play was damaging her own grandson. Instead, Beatrice's mask of devout Christian righteousness vanished completely. Her eyes narrowed into furious slits. She slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table with a loud, violent smack. The fine crystal glasses and silver cutlery rattled against the porcelain plates. "Leo, stop that whining right this instant," Beatrice snapped. Her voice was harsh, entirely devoid of any grandmotherly warmth or patience. "I will not tolerate a crying child ruining my Thanksgiving dinner." Leo flinched, burying his face into my blazer, his small body trembling against mine. Beatrice pointed a long, accusing finger directly at my son. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she declared loudly to the rest of the table. "Look at how weak he is. This is grown folks' business and he is interrupting. You act just as spoiled, arrogant, and disrespectful as your mother. Marcus would be absolutely ashamed to see how soft and undisciplined you are raising this boy, Maya." The air in the room seemed to freeze. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a countdown to an explosion. Mentioning my dead husband was a dangerous line to cross. Using his name to emotionally abuse his only child was a declaration of war. A physiological shift happened inside my body. The rational patient part of my brain shut down entirely. The grace I had extended to this family out of respect for the man I loved evaporated into thin air. Every ounce of restraint I possessed vanished. They had wanted to push me to see how much abuse I would silently absorb just to maintain the illusion of family harmony. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my refusal to engage in their petty screaming matches meant I was defenseless. They were catastrophically wrong. The absolute final boundary had been crossed. Attacking me was one thing. I could weather their jealousy, their fake therapy buzzwords, and their pathetic power trips. But terrorizing my son and weaponizing his dead father's memory against him was an unforgivable offense. I stopped comforting Leo for a brief second and slowly lifted my head to look directly at Beatrice. The expression on my face must have been terrifying because Connor visibly shifted backward in his chair and Jasmine's smug smile instantly vanished. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or throw a plate to command the room. True power is quiet, and the fury I felt was absolute zero. The game of being the polite, accommodating widow was officially over. I pushed my chair back. The heavy mahogany legs scraped against the vintage Persian rug with a loud, grating sound that made several people around the table flinch. I stood up slowly, my posture impeccably straight, towering over the seated family members who had just eagerly voted for my exile. I reached down and took Leo by his small, trembling hand, pulling him gently away from the table and pressing him securely against my side. "Protecting your safe space?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it echoed through the cavernous dining room with terrifying clarity. "Is that what you call this? Beatrice?" Beatrice opened her mouth to issue another command, but the sheer intensity in my eyes stopped the words in her throat. "You invoke my dead husband's name to justify bullying his 8-year-old son." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You speak of generational wealth and family traditions while acting like a fragile, insecure tyrant. You want to talk about safe spaces, just like how you protected your safe space last year by banning me from the ribbon-cutting ceremony of your new restaurant location, purely because you were terrified I would wear a dress that outshone Jasmine. You are not protecting this family. You are protecting your ego." I turned my gaze to Connor, who immediately broke eye contact and stared intently at his half-eaten slice of turkey. "And you, Connor, keep the word toxic out of your mouth. The only thing toxic in this room is the staggering amount of entitlement coming from a man who has not paid a single bill with his own money in half a decade." I did not wait for his response. I squeezed Leo's hand and guided him away from the table. We walked toward the grand foyer where our coats were hung. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the hardwood floors. I helped Leo into his jacket, kneeling down to ensure it was zipped all the way up against the chill of the November evening. I wiped the remaining tears from his face with my thumb, looking directly into his eyes to show him that I was not afraid, and he did not need to be either. "We are leaving," I told him softly, making sure my voice carried back into the dining room. "And from this moment on, these people are no longer your family. You will never have to sit at a table where you are not entirely respected." He nodded, rubbing his eyes with the back of his sleeve. I picked up my purse and draped my cashmere coat over my arm. As I reached for the brass handle of the front door, Jasmine finally found her false courage. "Good riddance," she sneered loudly from the dining room, her voice dripping with artificial bravado. "Do not come crying to us and do not expect any help when you realize how hard it is out there alone in the real world." I paused. I did not turn my whole body around, just glanced back over my shoulder at the 12 people who had so eagerly participated in my public execution. They looked like a pathetic portrait of fake nobility sitting in a dining room funded by a failing restaurant chain they were too arrogant to realize was bleeding dry. I smiled. It was a cold, calculated expression devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "Enjoy your turkey, Beatrice," I said, my tone perfectly even and devoid of any emotion. "I hope it tastes exactly like victory, because it is the last meal you will ever enjoy in peace." I turned back, pulled the heavy oak door open, and stepped out, pulling it shut behind me with a definitive solid thud that severed my ties to the Caldwell family forever. The cold Atlanta air hit my face, instantly sharp and bracing. It felt like walking out of a suffocating tomb into pure, unadulterated oxygen. The crisp autumn wind whipped through my hair, but I felt nothing except an intense burning focus. I walked Leo to my car parked at the edge of the sprawling circular driveway. I opened the rear door and made sure he was securely buckled in. His small hands gripped his seatbelt tightly, and he looked up at me with eyes that still held traces of fear from the confrontation. "Are we really never going back there, Mom?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly in the cool air. "Never," I promised him, leaning in to kiss his forehead. "I will never let anyone speak to you like that again, Leo. Not even your grandmother. You and I are a team. We do not need their permission to be happy, and we certainly do not need their table to eat." He nodded, a small sigh of relief escaping his lips as he sank back into the leather seat. I closed his door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the wheel. The heavy insulation of the car immediately blocked out the sounds of the neighborhood, wrapping us in a quiet, protective bubble. I started the engine, the low purr of the motor grounding me. As I drove the car down the long, manicured driveway and past the imposing iron gates of the Caldwell estate, I looked at the mansion in my rearview mirror one last time. They thought they had won. They truly believed that by voting me out, they had successfully stripped me of my power, my voice, and my connection to Marcus. They thought I was just a grieving widow they could intimidate and discard whenever I became too independent for their liking. They had no idea that they had just handed me the exact justification I needed to absolutely ruin them. The drive back to our penthouse in Midtown was quiet and tension-filled. I kept the radio off, letting the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt fill the silence inside the cabin. The city lights of Atlanta blurred past the windows in streaks of gold and red. In the rearview mirror, I watched Leo slowly relax his breathing, evening out, as the traumatic events of the evening began to fade into the safety of our car. I reached back and rested my hand on his knee, offering a silent reassurance that I was there. I was strong, and I was in complete control. My mind, however, was operating at 1,000 miles a minute. The lingering grief that had anchored me to the Caldwell family for the past 2 years had been entirely burned away. It was instantly replaced by the clinical, razor-sharp mindset of a corporate crisis manager. They wanted to protect their generational wealth. They wanted to protect their heritage. They wanted to exert dominance over the one person who actually held the keys to their entire kingdom. I pulled the car into the secure underground parking garage of our building. I shifted the gear into park, but left the engine running for just a moment. I looked at Leo, who was already half asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional toll of the evening. I leaned back against the headrest, the adrenaline finally settling into a cold, hard resolve. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in the dim light of the parking garage. I bypassed the dozens of missed messages and notifications from friends wishing me a happy holiday. Instead, I opened my encrypted messaging app and scrolled down to the contact for my lead attorney, a brilliant cutthroat woman named Valerie, who handled all of my most sensitive corporate acquisitions. I tapped the screen, my thumbs moving with absolute precision. There was no hesitation, no second guessing, and absolutely no mercy left in my heart. I typed a single decisive directive. Initiate the Phoenix Protocol. It is time to collect. I hit send, locked the screen, and stepped out of the car, fully prepared to watch the Caldwell empire burn to the ground. I carried a sleeping Leo from the parking garage up to our penthouse. The quiet hum of the private elevator was a stark contrast to the screaming chaos we had just left behind at the estate. Inside, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering Atlanta skyline, a sprawling grid of power and money that operated on logic, contracts, and leverage. I laid Leo in his bed, pulled the heavy duvet up to his chin, and stood in the doorway watching him breathe. He was safe here. They would never touch him or his peace of mind again. The next morning arrived with the sharp, buzzing vibration of my phone against the marble surface of the kitchen island. It was barely 7 o'clock. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, wrapped my silk robe tighter around my shoulders, and picked up the device. The screen was completely choked with notifications. There were dozens of missed calls from extended family members, frantic text messages from mutual acquaintances in the local church community, and urgent links forwarded by the media monitoring team at my firm. I bypassed the noise and tapped the first link sent by my assistant. It opened directly to a live broadcast recording on social media. There was Jasmine broadcasting to her 50,000 followers. She was sitting in the Caldwell's sunroom, wearing an oversized cozy sweater with her hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore absolutely no makeup. It was a carefully curated, highly calculated look designed to project raw vulnerability and profound emotional devastation. She was dabbing at her eyes with a crumpled tissue, staring tragically into the camera lens, as if pleading directly with the viewer's soul. "I never thought I would have to make a video like this," Jasmine whimpered, her voice quivering with practiced theatrical sorrow. "But my family is hurting today. We are bleeding. Yesterday, on a day meant for giving thanks, my sister-in-law Maya completely shattered our hearts. We tried so hard to welcome her. We tried to offer her a safe space to heal after my brother Marcus passed away. But she stood up at our dinner table completely unprovoked, screamed at my mother, and walked out. I leaned back against the cool marble counter, taking a slow, methodical sip of my coffee as I watched the performance unfold. As a professional, I had to admit Jasmine was hitting all the right notes for a digital sympathy tour. "She took my nephew away from us," Jasmine continued, allowing a single perfectly timed tear to roll down her cheek. "She is a greedy, cold woman who only cared about the Caldwell name when Marcus was alive to pay for her lifestyle. Now that he is gone, she has abandoned the very people who loved him most. She thinks she is above us. Please pray for my mother. She is absolutely devastated by this betrayal." The comments rolling across the bottom of the screen were entirely predictable. Strangers who knew nothing about our lives were calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a wicked widow who had used a good God-fearing family for their money. Jasmine was soaking up the digital validation, replying to the most dramatic comments with prayer hand emojis and tragic little broken hearts. She was feeding the beast of public opinion, painting herself as the innocent victim of my supposed cruelty. Before the video even finished playing, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from Valerie, my lead attorney. I swiped to answer, keeping my eyes fixed on Jasmine's tear-stained face on the tablet in front of me. "Tell me you are watching this absolute train wreck," Valerie said, her voice crisp, sharp, and entirely devoid of panic. "I am watching," I replied calmly. "She is putting on quite a show. I am almost impressed by the lack of makeup. It really sells the victim narrative to her followers." "Well, it gets worse," Valerie noted, the sound of her clicking a keyboard echoing through the speaker. "Beatrice did not just sit back and let Jasmine do all the talking. I just got an alert from our legal monitoring software. Your mother-in-law submitted an expedited filing to the state registry this morning. She officially removed your name from the Marcus Caldwell Memorial Scholarship Fund." That piece of information landed like a physical blow to my chest. The scholarship fund was not just a charity. It was a project Marcus and I had dreamed up together before he died, designed to help underprivileged youth in Atlanta attend college. It was a piece of his heart, and I had personally funded the initial endowment of $200,000 to get it off the ground. Beatrice erasing my name from it was not just a petty slight. It was a deliberate, malicious attempt to erase my history with the man I loved and claim my financial contribution as her own charitable work. She appointed Connor as the new co-director of the fund. Valerie added, her tone sharpening with professional disgust. Connor, a man who cannot even balance his own personal checking account, is now managing a charity endowment. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. The anger surged inside me, hot and violent, demanding that I strike back immediately. My primal instinct was to draft a scathing press release. I wanted to post the bank receipts proving I had paid off Jasmine's luxury car. I wanted to expose Connor's massive gambling debts to the entire board of directors at Beatrice's megachurch. I wanted to burn their public image to ash by the end of the business day. But I am a crisis manager. I handle catastrophic public relations disasters from massive corporations. I know exactly how this game is played, and I know the fatal mistake that rookies make when they are under attack. Reacting out of emotion is how you lose your leverage. Do we issue a cease and desist? Valerie asked clearly, anticipating my usual aggressive legal tactics. I can have a gag order drafted and served to Jasmine by noon. We can hit Beatrice with an emergency injunction regarding the scholarship fund by the end of the day. We can shut this whole circus down. No, I answered, my voice incredibly steady as my professional armor locked firmly into place. We do absolutely nothing. Valerie paused on the other end of the line. Nothing. Maya, they are dragging your name through the mud in front of the entire city. Jasmine's video already has 20,000 views and counting. The church community is eating this up. If you do not control the narrative now, the damage to your personal reputation could be severe. Let them eat, I said. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the morning traffic winding through the streets of Atlanta. When an opponent is digging their own grave, the absolute worst thing you can do is take the shovel out of their hands. I instructed Valerie to initiate a complete and total communication blackout. There would be no press releases, no legal threats, no angry text messages to the family group chat. I even deleted my own social media applications from my phone to remove any temptation to look or respond. Let Jasmine scream into the digital void. Let Beatrice think she had won the public relations war. Let Connor sit back in his borrowed house and truly believe he was now a legitimate executive of a charitable fund. They want a reaction. Valerie, I explained, watching the morning sunlight glint off the glass skyscrapers surrounding my building. They want me to look angry, erratic, and defensive. If I fight back right now, it becomes a messy, emotional family feud. It becomes a case of he said, she said. But if I stay completely silent, their lies become an uncontested public record. Jasmine's video is a documented act of defamation. Beatrice's filing is a documented act of financial manipulation. They are building my lawsuit for me brick by brick, and their own arrogance prevents them from realizing it. Silence is terrifying to narcissists. When they attack you and you do not fight back, they do not know what to do. They assume they have broken you. They get sloppy. They get bolder. They overplay their hand. I was going to give the Caldwell family enough rope to hang themselves twice over. Understood, Valerie said, the fierce predatory approval evident in her tone. We maintain strict radio silence. Let them think they have secured the victory. But what about the Phoenix Protocol? Do I proceed with the financial audit on the restaurants? Accelerate it. I commanded, turning my back on the window and walking toward my home office. I want every ledger, every lease agreement, and every vendor contract associated with Caldwell's heritage scoured by the end of the week. I want to know exactly how much they owe, who they owe it to, and where every single penny of their cash flow has gone. I took a final sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in the reality of the war I had just silently declared. They think this is a social media war, I said quietly into the phone. They think public opinion is the highest currency. They have absolutely no idea that I am about to repo their entire reality. The rest of the week proceeded exactly as I had calculated. I maintained an absolute blackout across all communication channels. I did not log into social media. I did not respond to the passive-aggressive text messages flooding in from my sister-in-law. I knew that my silence was driving Beatrice completely out of her mind. Women like my mother-in-law feed on conflict. They view every argument as a stage where they can play the victim or the righteous matriarch. By refusing to step onto her stage, I was starving her of the attention she desperately craved. She needed to provoke me to force a reaction that would validate the terrible things she was saying about me to her church congregation. By Thursday afternoon, her patience finally snapped. My phone lit up on my desk, the caller identification displaying Beatrice Caldwell. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow breath and centering myself before pressing the green button. I did not say hello. I simply waited. Maya Beatrice barked, her voice clipped and dripping with artificial corporate authority. I am calling you in my official capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of Caldwell's Heritage. I smiled to myself, leaning back in my ergonomic desk chair. Good afternoon, Beatrice. What can I do for the Chief Executive Officer today? Beatrice cleared her throat, clearly annoyed by my calm demeanor. Since you have made the unfortunate decision to turn your back on this family and our traditions, the Board of Directors has been reviewing our corporate assets. It has come to our attention that you are still in possession of the 2023 Range Rover autobiography. As that vehicle is legally registered under the restaurant group for tax purposes, you are no longer entitled to use it. I expect you to return the company vehicle to the estate immediately. You can leave the keys in the mailbox. I closed my eyes and let the sheer audacity of her demand wash over me. The Range Rover was indeed registered to Caldwell's Heritage. 2 years ago, when the restaurants were facing a brutal tax audit, Marcus had begged me to register my new car under the company name to help offset their liabilities with a massive depreciation deduction. I had agreed to help his family, but the entire down payment, the monthly installments, and the extravagant custom upgrades had all been paid directly from my personal consulting firm account. Beatrice knew this. She knew she was legally stealing a vehicle I had paid for, using a tax loophole as her weapon. She expected me to cry. She expected me to hire a lawyer and fight her for the car, dragging out a messy legal battle that would give her months of drama to complain about. I am so sorry for the oversight, Beatrice, I replied, my voice smooth, bright, and incredibly pleasant. You are absolutely right. The vehicle belongs to the company. I will have it returned to your driveway tonight. The line went dead quiet. Beatrice was completely disarmed. She had braced herself for a screaming match, and I had just handed her a surrender. Well, she stammered, her authoritative tone faltering. Yes, see that you do. Make sure it is washed. She hung up the phone. I set my device down on the desk and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Beatrice thought she had just scored a massive victory. She probably envisioned Jasmine or Connor driving my luxury SUV around Buckhead by tomorrow morning, showing off their spoils of war. I picked up my phone again and called a man named Darius. He owned a high-end custom auto shop in South Atlanta and owed me a massive favor after I saved his business from a devastating zoning dispute last year. Darius, I said when he answered. I need a specialized extraction team at my penthouse parking garage tonight at midnight. Bring a flatbed tow truck, heavy-duty power tools, and 4 solid concrete cinder blocks. At exactly midnight, Darius and 2 of his mechanics pulled into the private underground garage of my building. I handed them the keys to the gleaming black Range Rover. The vehicle was a masterpiece, but the true value was in the aftermarket upgrades. I had personally spent $25,000 on custom-forged alloy wheels, high-performance, low-profile tires, and a bespoke interior sound system. I stood by with a cup of coffee and watched as Darius and his crew went to work with Formula One precision. They jacked up the heavy SUV and stripped off all 4 custom tires and rims. They removed the imported floor mats. I even had them carefully uninstall the upgraded sound system interface that I had purchased out of pocket, leaving only the gaping factory standard wires hanging from the dashboard. Everything I had personally financed was stripped away, leaving the bare, undrivable bones of the vehicle that technically belonged to Caldwell's Heritage. By 2 in the morning, the stripped-down Range Rover was winched onto the back of the flatbed tow truck. I climbed into the passenger seat of the truck cab next to Darius. We drove through the quiet, sleeping streets of Atlanta, heading straight for the wealthy, highly secure neighborhood of Buckhead. The Caldwell estate was protected by an iron security gate, but I still had the master pass code. I punched in the numbers, and the heavy iron doors swung open. Darius backed the massive diesel truck up the long, manicured driveway, the reversing alarm echoing loudly in the dead of night. We stopped directly in front of Beatrice's grand front doors, right beside her pristine rose bushes and her beloved water fountain. With a loud hydraulic hiss, the flatbed tilted backward. The heavy steel chains unspooled and the Range Rover slid down the ramp. Darius and his men carefully guided the vehicle until it came to a rest directly on top of the 4 concrete cinder blocks we had brought. The metal undercarriage groaned as it settled onto the rough gray blocks. It looked like a salvaged wreck abandoned in a scrapyard, sitting right in the middle of a multi-million-dollar estate driveway. I stepped out of the truck into the cool night air. I walked up to the windshield of the crippled vehicle. From my coat pocket, I pulled out a heavy piece of cream-colored cardstock. I had written a message in beautiful, sweeping calligraphy. I slipped the thick envelope firmly beneath the windshield wiper. The note read, "Company car returned." Tires were paid for by me. I climbed back into the tow truck, and we drove away into the night, leaving the front gates wide open behind us. I was back in my penthouse sitting in my kitchen and sipping a fresh espresso when the sun finally rose over the city. At exactly 7 in the morning, my phone screen illuminated. It was a call from Connor. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, a call came through from Jasmine, then another from Connor. Then 3 back-to-back calls from Beatrice herself. I did not answer a single one. I simply sat at my kitchen island imagining the absolute chaos unfolding miles away. I pictured Beatrice dressed in her silk morning robe stepping out of her grand front doors to pick up the morning newspaper. I pictured the sheer, breathless horror on her face when she saw a $100,000 luxury SUV sitting on concrete cinder blocks in her elegant driveway for all her wealthy, judgmental neighbors to see. I imagined Connor coming out to inspect the damage, realizing the car he probably intended to claim as his own CFO company vehicle was completely undrivable and stripped of its most valuable components. They wanted to play corporate games. They wanted to use legal technicalities to strip me of my assets and humiliate me. But they were amateurs playing against a seasoned professional. I had followed Beatrice's instructions to the exact letter of the law. I had returned the company property. I just made sure to keep exactly what was mine. My phone buzzed again, this time with a frantic, furious text message from Beatrice. It was a long paragraph demanding I pay for new tires, threatening to call the police, and calling me an unhinged lunatic. I read the message, smiled, and swiped it away. Let them call the police. I had every receipt and bank statement proving my ownership of the removed parts. The authorities would call it a civil matter and leave them standing in their driveway looking like fools. This was just the appetizer. The Caldwell family thought they were dealing with a heartbroken widow throwing a tantrum over a car. They had no idea that while they were busy screaming at a vehicle on cinder blocks, my legal team was quietly preparing to detonate the entire foundation of their financial existence. The real war had not even started yet. At 10 in the morning, I walked into the glass-walled conference room of Sterling and Vance, the most ruthless corporate law firm in Atlanta. Valerie was already waiting at the head of a massive mahogany table. She wore a tailored emerald green suit, her natural hair styled in an immaculate crown. Valerie was a legal predator who did not lose cases, and she was the exact weapon I needed. She looked up from her tablet as I took a seat, sliding a thick, leather-bound portfolio toward me. I saw the photos of the Range Rover. Valerie said, a razor-sharp smile touching the corners of her mouth. A bold move, Maya. But we have much bigger fish to fry today. Are you ready to look at the real numbers? I nodded, opening the portfolio. Inside lay the commercial lease agreements for Caldwell's Heritage. The family prided themselves on their 3 prime restaurant locations across Atlanta. To the public, those locations were the crown jewels of Beatrice's empire. What the public did not know, and what Beatrice had conveniently chosen to ignore in her arrogance, was who actually owned the ground those restaurants stood on. 3 years ago, before Marcus died, the family business was quietly drowning. Beatrice had mismanaged funds overspent on church donations for social clout and completely ignored commercial real estate trends. Their previous landlord was preparing to evict them from all 3 locations. Marcus had come to me devastated, begging for a solution to save his mother's legacy. I had the capital from my consulting firm, but I knew Beatrice's pride would never allow her to accept a financial bailout from the daughter-in-law she deemed an unworthy outsider. So I created a blind corporate entity named Apex Properties. Apex swooped in, purchased all 3 commercial lots in cash, and became their new landlord. Beatrice spent years bragging to her friends about how she had negotiated a brilliant deal with a massive real estate conglomerate. She never knew the conglomerate was just me sitting at my laptop in our penthouse, quietly keeping her business from going under. Valerie tapped a manicured fingernail against the top document. "They signed the renewal yesterday," she stated, her voice brimming with professional satisfaction. Connor actually facilitated the signing, acting in his new self-appointed capacity as Chief Financial Officer. He is even more incompetent than we anticipated. He did not have external counsel review the terms. I asked, tracing the wet ink of Connor's signature at the bottom of the page. "Not a single lawyer," Valerie confirmed, leaning forward. "He assumed it was a standard extension. He blindly signed a 10-year commercial lease renewal with a 30% immediate rent hike. He wanted to look like a decisive executive for Beatrice, so he rushed the paperwork. But more importantly, he signed off on the accelerated default clause." Valerie pulled up a secondary financial report on the large monitor behind her. According to the original agreement established when Apex Properties bought the lots, Caldwell's Heritage was required to complete $500,000 in infrastructure and safety upgrades by the end of this fiscal year. They have not completed a single upgrade. They have not even pulled the city permits. Under the new accelerated default clause, Connor, just authorized Apex Properties, has the right to demand that entire $500,000 sum immediately. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen as Valerie delivered the killing blow. "If they cannot pay the full amount within 7 days, we have the legal authority to terminate the lease, seize all physical assets inside the buildings to cover the debt, and lock the doors permanently." I leaned back in the plush leather chair, letting the magnitude of their stupidity wash over me. Connor had just handed me the keys to their entire kingdom because he wanted to play corporate executive without doing the actual work. Beatrice had authorized it because she trusted a white man using business buzzwords over the financial reality of her own failing enterprise. They had voted me out of the family, completely unaware that I literally owned the foundation their family stood on. "They are already bleeding cash," I noted, looking at the banking summaries Valerie had pulled. "There is no way they have $500,000 in liquid assets. They cannot even afford Jasmine's credit card minimums." "They are completely underwater," Valerie agreed, closing the portfolio with a decisive snap. "The moment we issue the demand letter, the clock starts. They will panic. They will try to secure emergency loans, but their credit is leveraged to the absolute limit. When that fails, they will default." I looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline. The Caldwells thought they could discard me like trash. They thought they could erase my son from their legacy. They had vastly underestimated the woman sitting at their Thanksgiving table. "Draft the demand letter, Valerie," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Send it by secure courier directly to the flagship restaurant. Let them see exactly what happens when they disturb my peace." I stepped out of the air-conditioned lobby of Sterling and Vance and into the crisp, bright Atlanta afternoon. The city around me buzzed with the relentless energy of commerce and ambition. For the first time since Marcus passed away, the heavy, suffocating weight of grief that usually anchored my chest had completely vanished. It was replaced by a sharp, vibrating sense of purpose. I walked toward my waiting car, my mind already running through the logistical timeline of the impending corporate slaughter I had just authorized. Before my hand even touched the door handle of my vehicle, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my silk trousers. I slid into the quiet leather interior of the back seat, instructing my driver to head back to the penthouse. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the screen. It was a string of messages from Connor. The audacity of this man truly knew no bounds. Less than 48 hours ago, he had sat at a Thanksgiving table and weaponized therapy buzzwords to publicly excommunicate me from the family. Now he was texting me as if we were friendly colleagues navigating a minor corporate transition. I opened the message thread. The first text was a photograph of a sleek, newly printed business card resting on a polished oak desk. The card read, Connor Bradley, Chief Financial Officer, Caldwell's Heritage Restaurant Group. The second message was a block of text dripping with his signature brand of condescending fake progressivism. Maya, I hope you are taking the time you need to find your peace. The message began. I wanted to personally reach out and share some exciting news. Beatrice and the board have officially appointed me as the Chief Financial Officer of the restaurant group. It is a massive responsibility, but I am ready to guide this family into a new era of prosperity, mindful growth, and generational stability. I read the words with a cold, detached amusement. The board he was referring to consisted solely of Beatrice and Jasmine. They had effectively promoted a man who could not successfully manage a suburban lemonade stand to oversee a multi-million-dollar restaurant chain that was currently hemorrhaging cash. A third message popped up accompanied by a PDF attachment. In light of your decision to step away from the family ecosystem, Connor wrote, we need to clean up some administrative loose ends for tax purposes. Attached is a standard relinquishment form for the 3% equity share Marcus left you in the operational holding company. It is a minor administrative detail, but it will help me streamline our corporate tax structure moving forward. Please print, sign, and return this by Monday morning. We all agree it is best to have a clean, healthy break so the family can truly begin to heal. I stared at the screen, letting the sheer blinding hubris of his demand wash over me. He was actually asking me to voluntarily forfeit the very last legal thread tying me to my late husband's operating business. He assumed I was too emotionally exhausted from the Thanksgiving ambush to fight for a measly 3%. He truly believed that his brand new self-appointed title gave him absolute leverage over me. He thought putting Chief Financial Officer in his email signature somehow made him untouchable. He had absolutely no idea that as his anonymous landlord, I already owned the entire chessboard. A weaker woman might have fired back a furious paragraph. A less experienced professional might have pointed out that his new title was completely worthless because the company he was so proud to manage was technically insolvent. But I did not type a paragraph. I did not justify my existence or defend my assets. I tapped the screen, keeping my response surgically precise, designed to inflict maximum psychological discomfort. I knew exactly what was sitting inside the heavy steel floor safe in the back office of the Caldwell's Heritage flagship location. Marcus had installed that safe years ago. It held the daily cash deposits, the emergency operating funds, and the sensitive corporate documents. But I also knew, thanks to the preliminary forensic audit, Valerie's team was already compiling that Connor had been quietly dipping into that exact safe for months. He had been skimming cash to cover his mounting gambling debts and to buy designer gifts for his mistress, masking the missing money with incredibly sloppy accounting entries. He thought no one would ever have the authority to verify. I also knew that the disastrous 10-year lease extension he had just blindly signed was sitting right on top of those fabricated ledgers inside that very same safe. I tapped out my reply. Congratulations on the new title, Connor. Check the safe. I hit send. I watched the screen as the tiny delivery indicator turned into a red receipt. Connor had seen it immediately. I imagined him sitting in his new office, the smug smile slowly sliding off his face as his eyes scanned my 6-word response. I watched the typing bubble appear on my screen. It bounced for 3 seconds, then disappeared. It appeared again a moment later, then vanished once more. He was hesitating. He was panicking. Check the safe. It was a cryptic directive that carried 1,000 different threats. Did I know about the missing cash? Did I know about the lease? Did I leave something in there for him to find? The ambiguity was the weapon. I was letting him know that his perfectly constructed facade of corporate authority was completely transparent to me. I could see right through him, straight to the rotting, corrupt core of his actions. No further response came through. The digital silence spoke volumes. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket as my car pulled up to my building. Connor would undoubtedly march straight to that back office. He would spin the dial on the floor safe. He would look at the stacks of documents, the dwindling cash reserves, and his own fabricated ledgers. He would try to convince himself that my text was just the bitter, dramatic rambling of a defeated widow. He would run back to Beatrice and Jasmine, assuring them that he had everything under control and that I was just lashing out because I was jealous of his new promotion. They would probably pop an expensive bottle of champagne tonight to celebrate his new title. They would toast to their safe space and their generational wealth, feeling incredibly smug and overly confident in their newly secured family hierarchy. They would sleep soundly tonight, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath their feet was rigged with high-grade legal explosives and my thumb was resting firmly on the detonator. The weekend passed exactly as I predicted. By Sunday morning, the Caldwell estate was buzzing with the sounds of a lavish, celebratory brunch. Beatrice had spared no expense to honor Connor and his newly minted title of Chief Financial Officer. They had hired a private chef to prepare a massive spread of shrimp and grits-buttered biscuits and bottomless mimosas. The dining room, the very same room where they had voted to banish me just over a week ago, was packed with the same aunts, uncles, and church friends who had watched my public execution in silence. I made sure my courier arrived right at the peak of their celebration. Jasmine was likely holding court near the mimosa bar, loudly praising her husband's business acumen to anyone who would listen. Beatrice was undoubtedly circulating through the room accepting congratulations on securing the family legacy and making pointed remarks about how peaceful the house felt, without my toxic energy bringing everyone down. Connor was playing the humble executive wearing a tailored blazer and nodding sagely as relatives patted him on the back. They were completely intoxicated by their own false narrative. Then the heavy brass knocker on the front door sounded. It was not a late arriving guest. It was a licensed process server dressed in a sharp gray suit holding a thick, legal-sized envelope. When the housekeeper opened the door, the server explicitly asked for Connor Bradley, the chief financial officer of Caldwell's Heritage Restaurant Group. I can only imagine the sheer pride Connor must have felt when he was summoned to the grand foyer. He probably adjusted his jacket and walked with an exaggerated swagger, thrilled that his new corporate title was already being recognized. He signed the delivery manifest with a flourish, took the heavy envelope, and casually strolled back into the dining room. Beatrice, always hungry to be at the center of attention, stopped her conversation. She asked Connor what had been delivered, assuming it was a congratulatory gift from a vendor or a prominent church member. Connor smiled, tearing open the thick seal of the envelope. He pulled out the crisp, watermarked legal documents bearing the imposing logo of Apex Properties. The smile slid off his face so fast it must have looked like a physical injury. As he read the first page, all the color drained from his cheeks. His hands began to shake the expensive paper, rattling audibly in the sudden quiet of the room. The confident, progressive executive act vanished in an instant, replaced by the raw, suffocating panic of a man staring directly into the abyss. Jasmine noticed her husband freezing and stepped forward, laughing nervously. She asked him what was wrong, playfully attempting to peek over his shoulder. Connor could not speak. His throat worked silently, but no words came out. Beatrice lost her patience. She marched across the Persian rug, snatched the documents right out of his trembling hands, and adjusted her reading glasses to look at the letter herself. It was a formal notice of accelerated default and demand for payment. The legal language was dense, but the ultimate message was violently clear. The letter explicitly outlined that Caldwell's Heritage was in severe violation of their commercial lease agreement. The mandatory infrastructure and safety upgrades required by the contract Connor had blindly signed just days prior had been completely ignored. The cost of those upgrades was $500,000. The next paragraph delivered the fatal blow. Apex Properties was demanding the full $500,000 to be deposited into an escrow account within exactly 7 calendar days. If the funds were not received by the deadline, Apex Properties would exercise its legal right to immediately terminate the commercial lease for all 3 restaurant locations. Furthermore, the landlord would seize all physical assets inside the buildings, including the commercial kitchen equipment, the furniture, and the inventory, to cover the outstanding debt. The locks on all three Caldwell's Heritage restaurants would be changed at midnight on the seventh day. Beatrice dropped the papers onto the dining table as if they had caught fire. The entire room descended into absolute chaos. The clinking of mimosa glasses stopped. The private chef paused in the kitchen. Relatives stared in shock as Beatrice grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. $500,000. It was a staggering, impossible number for a restaurant chain that was barely scraping by to meet its weekly payroll. Connor scrambled to pick up the papers, his voice cracking, as he tried to explain to a furious Beatrice that he had not read the fine print of the lease extension. He tried to claim it was a predatory trap, a simple misunderstanding that could be negotiated away over a friendly business lunch. But Beatrice knew better. She knew Apex Properties was a massive, faceless conglomerate that did not negotiate with failing local businesses. Jasmine began to cry, her perfectly applied makeup running down her face as the reality of the situation crashed into her. If the restaurants closed, her luxury lifestyle evaporated instantly. The credit cards would stop working. The social status she wielded like a weapon in her church circles would turn into profound public humiliation. Beatrice turned her wrath on Connor, screaming at him in front of the entire family. She demanded to know how he could have signed such a lethal document without having a lawyer review it first. Connor, true to his cowardly nature, immediately tried to deflect the blame. He stuttered out weak excuses, claiming he was just trying to secure the locations quickly to protect the family from rising market rates. He threw therapy buzzwords around, asking Beatrice to regulate her emotions and process this hurdle together as a team. But there was no therapy language that could fix $500,000 in immediate debt. They had precisely 1 week to find money that simply did not exist. Their credit was maxed out. Their assets were leveraged. No bank in the state of Georgia would approve a high-risk commercial loan of that magnitude for a struggling restaurant group in just 7 days. They were trapped in a burning building, and they had locked the doors themselves. Sitting in my penthouse across the city, I checked the tracking notification on my phone. Delivered and signed for by Connor Bradley at 11:14 in the morning. I set the phone down and took a slow, deeply satisfying bite of my own breakfast. The countdown had officially begun. They had exactly 168 hours to watch everything they cared about turn to dust. The screaming in the Caldwell dining room had reached a fever pitch, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and rattling the fine china. Connor was desperately trying to talk his way out of the $500,000 disaster, waving his hands and using every conflict resolution phrase he could muster to calm Beatrice down. He pleaded for a moment to breathe, begging the family to form a united front against this aggressive corporate landlord. He was right in the middle of a sentence about leaning into their collective resilience when a sharp, distinct chime cut through the chaos. The sound came from Beatrice's personal tablet, which rested on the sideboard near the mimosa station. It was the specific high-priority alert tone she reserved exclusively for secure banking notifications and corporate communications. Beatrice stopped yelling. She marched over to the sideboard, her chest heaving with exertion, and snatched up the device. She swiped the screen to unlock it, fully expecting another automated alert about their overdrawn accounts. Instead, she found an anonymous, highly encrypted email waiting in her primary inbox. The subject line was written in stark clinical text: Caldwell's Heritage Restaurant Group Forensic Audit. Executive Summary enclosed. She tapped the attachment. A pristine, meticulously organized PDF document filled the screen. There was no preamble, no greeting, and no signature. It was simply 20 pages of undeniable hard data. Beatrice adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the first paragraph. As she read the bolded executive summary, the remaining color drained from her face. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she had to set the tablet down flat on the marble surface just to keep the words steady. The audit bypassed the devastating commercial lease entirely and focused squarely on the internal cash flow of the restaurants over the past 18 months. The numbers were devastatingly clear. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from the operating accounts. The total amount extracted was exactly $150,000. Beatrice's eyes darted down the page to the methodology section. The thief had not been particularly clever. They had used fake vendor invoices for kitchen repairs that never happened, inflated the cost of weekly inventory orders, and quietly skimmed thick stacks of cash directly from the heavy steel floor safe in the back office of the flagship location. The same safe Maya had mockingly told Connor to check just days ago. But the audit did not just stop at how the money was stolen. It detailed exactly where every single stolen dollar had gone. Beatrice began to read the expenditures out loud, her voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal register that paralyzed everyone in the room. She read the routing numbers linking the restaurant's accounts directly to high-stakes offshore betting networks. She read the transaction histories for thousands of dollars lost on digital poker tables and sports books. Connor took a step backward, his face turning the color of ash. He bumped into the edge of the dining table, sending a crystal glass shattering to the floor. Beatrice did not stop reading. She scrolled to the next page, her voice rising in pitch and volume. She read off the credit card receipts for weekend stays at luxury boutique hotels in Midtown Atlanta. She read the monthly lease payments for a high-rise condominium entirely disconnected from the Caldwell family estate. Finally, she read the itemized receipts from high-end jewelers and designer boutiques, diamond tennis bracelets, red-soled heels, custom imported handbags. Jasmine stood frozen on the other side of the room. She looked down at her own wrists, devoid of any new diamonds. She looked at her own shoes. None of those luxury purchases had ever made it into her closet. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The money was not just going to cover Connor's crippling gambling addiction. It was funding a fully separate, highly expensive life for a mistress. The perfectly curated sanctuary of the Caldwell home imploded. Jasmine let out a piercing, visceral shriek that echoed off the walls. She lunged across the dining room, her hands formed into claws, launching herself directly at her husband. The pristine, celebratory brunch turned into an immediate physical altercation. Aunts and uncles shouted in shock, rushing forward to pull a screaming, thrashing Jasmine off of the man she had just proudly defended to the entire world. Connor scrambled backward, tripping over overturned chairs and pleading for his life. He looked like a cornered rat. His progressive, sensitive facade was completely obliterated. He tried to stammer out a defense, claiming the email was a malicious cyber attack, a targeted framing job designed to tear the family apart. He pointed a trembling finger at the tablet and shrieked that Maya must have fabricated the entire document as revenge. But Beatrice was not a fool when it came to reading bank statements. She looked at the timestamps, the routing numbers, and the specific dates of the cash withdrawals. She knew they matched the exact days Connor had volunteered to personally handle the restaurant deposits. She realized with a crushing wave of humiliation that she had handed the keys of her empire to a parasitic fraud who was draining her dry right under her nose, all while he smiled in her face and ate at her Thanksgiving table. The wealthy church friends and extended relatives who had gathered to celebrate Connor's promotion immediately began making hurried excuses. They gathered their coats and practically ran for the front door, eager to escape the radioactive blast zone of the Caldwell family's absolute degradation. In less than 20 minutes, Beatrice had lost her business, her dignity, and her audience. Sitting in my penthouse miles away, I watched my phone screen light up with an incoming call from Valerie. I answered it on the first ring, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The payload was delivered and opened. Valerie reported, her voice thick with professional satisfaction. "We have confirmation that the encrypted file was accessed from their primary IP address." I smiled, turning to look out over the city. "Excellent." Valerie chuckled softly. Delivering the lease demand and the embezzlement audit within 10 minutes of each other was a stroke of absolute genius, Maya. You gave them a crisis they could not possibly manage. That is the fundamental essence of crisis management, I explained calmly, tracing the edge of my coffee cup. If I only sent the lease demand, they would have a common enemy. Beatrice, Jasmine, and Connor would have united their panic and pooled whatever pathetic resources they had left to try and fight Apex Properties. They would have formed a trauma bond over being victimized by a ruthless corporate landlord. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment before delivering the punchline. But by dropping the audit right on top of the eviction notice, I eliminated their ability to unite. I destroyed their trust in each other. Right now, Beatrice cannot focus on saving her restaurants because she is too busy realizing her trusted son-in-law has been stealing from her. Jasmine cannot focus on her social standing because she is too busy dealing with the public humiliation of a broke, cheating husband. I did not just burn their house down. I threw a grenade into the living room and locked the doors from the outside. Divide and conquer Valerie. They are too busy tearing each other apart to even think about coming after me. Valerie agreed, her tone shifting back to strict business. The clock is ticking on the $500,000. What is our next move? We wait, I replied smoothly. We sit back and we watch them drown. Beatrice is a proud, desperate woman. Once the initial shock wears off, she will realize she has absolutely no one left to turn to. Connor is a liability, and Jasmine is useless in a financial crisis. Beatrice is going to realize that the only person with the capital, the connections, and the corporate power to save her from this nightmare is the exact same woman she just voted out of her family. I hung up the phone and walked over to my desk. I opened my calendar and cleared my schedule for the rest of the week. The Caldwells had wanted to protect their peace. Now they were going to learn exactly how loud the consequences of their arrogance could be. Beatrice was going to call me. She was going to beg, and I was going to make sure she felt every single ounce of the humiliation she had tried to force onto my son. The highly anticipated phone call did not come on Monday. It took exactly 48 hours for the reality of their situation to completely shatter Beatrice Caldwell's massive ego. By Tuesday morning, the walls of her Buckhead estate must have felt like a shrinking prison cell. She had undoubtedly exhausted every possible avenue. She had probably called every wealthy contact in her church congregation, every local bank manager she had ever invited to a charity gala, and every shady private lender willing to return her desperate voicemails. None of them were going to hand over $500,000 to a restaurant chain that was publicly bleeding cash and internally managed by an embezzling fraud. I was sitting in the sunroom of my penthouse when my private mobile manicurist, a meticulous woman named Sarah, finished applying the base coat to my nails. The morning sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling glass, warming the room. That was when my phone, resting flat on the glass coffee table, vibrated. The screen illuminated with a custom contact photo I had assigned years ago. It was a picture of Beatrice standing at a pulpit wearing a massive, ostentatious feathered hat, looking down at the congregation with absolute moral superiority. I instructed Sarah to pause for a moment. I reached out with a steady hand, tapped the green button, and placed the phone on speaker. I leaned back into the plush velvet of my armchair, entirely relaxed. Maya, sweetheart. The voice that came through the speaker was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. It was soft, dripping with a sickeningly sweet artificial maternal warmth. There was no trace of the woman who had violently slammed her hand on a mahogany dining table just days prior. There was no hint of the tyrant who had screamed at my crying 8-year-old son. It was the polished, practiced voice of the Caldwell matriarch attempting to reel a runaway asset back into her control. "Good morning, Beatrice," I replied. My tone was perfectly even, giving absolutely nothing away. I kept my voice as flat and reflective as a frozen lake. "Maya, I have been praying for you so hard these past few days." Beatrice continued, her tone thickening with fake sorrow. "We have all just been so incredibly worried about you and little Leo. The house has felt so empty without your presence. I know tensions ran a bit high during the holiday, but you know how passionate this family is. We are all just dealing with the heavy grief of losing Marcus. Emotions got the better of us. But at the end of the day, family is family." I watched Sarah carefully apply a layer of deep, rich burgundy polish to my index finger. The sheer audacity of Beatrice trying to frame a highly coordinated 12-person voting tribunal as a simple case of high emotions was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite history, gaslighting me into believing that my public excommunication was just a minor misunderstanding over a turkey dinner. I appreciate the prayers, Beatrice, I said smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure of this call? Beatrice hesitated. I could hear her taking a deep, shaky breath on the other end of the line. She was swallowing her massive pride, forcing it down her throat because she had absolutely no other choice. Well, Maya, the truth is that the family business has encountered a minor administrative hurdle. She began carefully selecting her corporate buzzwords to minimize the catastrophe. We are dealing with a deeply unprofessional and highly aggressive commercial landlord, a faceless conglomerate called Apex Properties. They have acquired the land under our 3 restaurant locations, and they are using predatory, borderline illegal tactics to threaten our operating leases. They sent us a completely fabricated demand for $500,000 regarding some outdated infrastructure clauses. It is pure extortion. I smiled, admiring the flawless application of the burgundy polish on my nails. A minor administrative hurdle. She was facing the total seizure of her entire restaurant empire in 5 days, and she was pitching it to me like a small accounting error. That sounds incredibly stressful, Beatrice, I replied, keeping my voice completely devoid of empathy. But I'm not sure why you are bringing this to my attention. Did you not just appoint Connor as your new chief financial officer? I saw his new business cards. Surely a man of his progressive, mindful business acumen can navigate a basic commercial lease dispute. The silence on the line was thick and heavy. I knew exactly why she could not rely on Connor. I knew he was currently the most hated man in her household, exposed as a thief, a liar, and an adulterer who had been siphoning their cash to fund a secret life. But Beatrice was far too proud to ever admit to an outsider that her golden family was a burning shipwreck. Connor is currently overwhelmed with operational restructuring. Beatrice lied smoothly, not missing a beat. He is managing the internal cash flow, which leaves us vulnerable on the external legal front. This is where we need your expertise, Maya. You deal with aggressive corporate bullies all the time. You manage crises for Fortune 500 companies. I need you to use your connections in the Atlanta business sector. I need you to find out who sits on the board of this Apex Properties, get them on the phone, and negotiate this ridiculous demand down to a reasonable figure. Or better yet, make it disappear entirely. She was not asking, she was demanding. Even in her absolute darkest hour of financial terror, she still viewed my professional skills as a free resource she was entitled to command. And why exactly would I do that, Beatrice? I asked, my voice dropping a fraction of an octave, losing the polite conversational sheen. Because family helps family, Maya. Beatrice snapped back, a flash of her true commanding anger breaking through the sweet facade. Because Marcus dedicated his entire life to building the Caldwell's heritage name alongside me. This is his legacy. You are his widow. You have a moral and spiritual obligation to protect the empire that your husband loved. You cannot just sit in your luxury penthouse downtown and watch his family be extorted by greedy corporate vultures. She was weaponizing my dead husband's memory again. She was attempting to use my grief as a leash to drag me back into servitude. It was the exact same tactic she had used for years to keep me quiet, compliant, and writing silent checks to cover their endless mistakes. Let me make sure I understand this sequence of events, Beatrice, I said, leaning forward in my chair. Sarah paused her work, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere of the room. Just last week, you sat at the head of your dining table and held a democratic vote to permanently ban me from the Caldwell family. You stated in front of a dozen witnesses that my toxic independence was ruining your safe space. Jasmine went on the internet to call me a greedy, wicked woman. You officially filed paperwork to erase my name from a charitable scholarship fund that I personally financed. I paused, letting the irrefutable facts hang in the air between us. And now, less than a week later, you are calling me to demand that I leverage my professional network to save your business from bankruptcy, all under the guise of family loyalty. Am I assessing this situation accurately? Maya, you are focusing on the past. Beatrice pleaded, her voice rising in pitch as panic began to bleed through her confident mask. I am talking about our future. I am talking about preserving the generational wealth that Leo is supposed to inherit. Do not do this for me. Do this for your son. If Caldwell's heritage falls, Leo loses his birthright. You have to step in and fix this. She was desperate. She was throwing every emotional manipulation tactic she had at the wall, hoping something would stick. She thought she was speaking to the same woman who used to bite her tongue and quietly clean up their messes to keep the peace. She thought my corporate resources were a magical shield she could hide behind to escape the consequences of her own horrific mismanagement. I looked at the phone on the glass table. I looked at the timer counting down the 7-day eviction notice I had legally served her. The trap was perfectly set. She had walked right into the center of it, blinded by her own arrogance and entitlement. She was begging the executioner to stop the blade, completely unaware of whose hand was actually resting on the lever. I signaled Sarah to finish applying the top coat to my nails. The small brush glided over the deep burgundy polish, mirroring the smooth, methodical way I was about to dismantle my mother-in-law. Beatrice was breathing heavily through the phone speaker, the raspy sound of a woman who was entirely out of options and running purely on desperate entitlement. "Maya, did you hear me?" Beatrice snapped, her impatience bleeding through the artificial sweetness she had tried to maintain. "I said I need you to get on the phone with whoever runs this Apex Properties today. We do not have time for your grudges." "I heard you perfectly, Beatrice," I replied, keeping my voice as calm as a placid ocean. "But I want to make sure we are absolutely clear on the parameters of your request. You want me to step in and save Caldwell's heritage. You want me to utilize my professional crisis management firm pro bono to rescue a corporate entity that your son-in-law essentially bankrupted. It is your family duty," she insisted, her voice rising to that familiar preaching cadence she used to command the church pews. "My family duty," I repeated, testing the words on my tongue. "That is fascinating. Because exactly 1 week ago, you held a democratic vote at your Thanksgiving table to officially revoke my family status. You looked me in the eye and told me my energy was toxic to your safe space. Jasmine broadcasted to 50,000 people that I was a wicked, greedy widow. And just yesterday, you legally erased my name from Marcus Memorial Scholarship Fund." "That was business," Beatrice stammered, scrambling to justify her blatant malice. "The scholarship fund needed active leadership, and you were pulling away." "And this is also business," I countered effortlessly. "You made your bed, Beatrice. You chose Connor to lead your financial future because he looks the part and feeds your ego. You let him sign a 10-year commercial lease with a 30% rent hike and an accelerated default clause without ever having a lawyer read the fine print. You handed him the keys to the safe, and he rewarded your blind trust by stealing $150,000 to spend on casino chips and a mistress." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I knew she was completely paralyzed by the fact that I already knew about the embezzlement. "How do you know about that?" Beatrice whispered, the sheer panic cracking her voice in half. "Because I am a professional," I said simply. "I know everything. I know your credit is maxed out. I know your vendors are preparing to freeze your supply accounts. I know you do not have $500,000 to pay that demand letter." "Then you know we are going to lose everything," Beatrice cried out, finally abandoning the strong matriarch act and fully leaning into desperate victimhood. "Maya, please. If you know all of this, then you know you have to make that call. You have to speak to the board of Apex Properties. You have the leverage. You have the corporate vocabulary to make them understand our situation. Please just ask them for an extension. Ask them for a favor." I lifted my hand, inspecting the flawless, glossy finish of my freshly painted nails. Sarah packed up her kit quietly, her eyes wide as she witnessed the utter destruction of a local dynasty right in my sunroom. "I cannot do that, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "Why not?" she shrieked, the panic boiling over into pure rage. "Are you really that vindictive? Are you going to let your dead husband's legacy be destroyed by a faceless corporate landlord just to prove a point? You are a useless, selfish girl. I always knew you were a mistake." I let her scream. I let her exhaust the last remaining fumes of her superiority. When she finally stopped to gasp for air, I delivered the fatal strike. "I am not letting a faceless corporate landlord destroy his legacy, Beatrice. I am doing it myself. I cannot call the board of Apex Properties to ask for an extension. I cannot ask them for a favor, because I cannot ask myself for a favor." The dead silence that fell over the speakerphone was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was absolute crushing quiet. The kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off before the debris even hits the ground. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice finally choked out, her voice barely a hollow croak. 3 years ago, I explained, articulating every single syllable with crystal clear precision. Your restaurant empire was already failing. You were 6 months behind on rent. The previous landlord was drawing up the eviction papers. Marcus came to me in tears, begging me to save the business his father started. He knew your pride would never allow you to accept a financial bailout from the daughter-in-law you hated. He knew you would rather go bankrupt than admit I had more financial power than your entire bloodline. I paused, letting the harsh reality sink deep into her bones. So I took my own money from my own consulting firm, and I created a blind corporate entity. I named it Apex Properties. I bought the commercial lots out from under your previous landlord. I paid in cash. I saved your business, Beatrice. I am Apex Properties. I own the dirt beneath your flagship restaurant. I own the walls of your commercial kitchens. I own the parking lot where you parked that stripped-down Range Rover last night. No. Beatrice gasped, the sound a mixture of denial and pure horror. No, that is a lie. You do not have that kind of money. I have exactly that kind of money, I corrected her. And I also have your signature on a binding commercial lease that clearly outlines the consequences of defaulting on your infrastructure upgrades. Upgrades that your golden boy Connor completely ignored. I listened to the sound of her rapid, hyperventilating breaths over the speaker. The matriarch who had ruled her family with an iron fist for decades was currently shrinking into nothingness. You voted me out of the family, I continued, my tone devoid of any mercy. You wanted to protect your safe space. Well, your safe space is currently sitting on my property, and your rent is due. You have 5 days left to deposit $500,000 into my escrow account. When you fail to do so, I will legally terminate your lease. I will seize every stove, every table, and every piece of silverware inside those buildings. Maya, please. Beatrice wailed, her pride entirely broken, her voice dissolving into pathetic, ugly sobs. You cannot do this. We will be ruined. We will have nothing. You should have thought about that before you raised your hand at the Thanksgiving table, I replied coldly. I reached forward and pressed the red button on the screen. The call disconnected, cutting off her desperate weeping. I set the phone face down on the glass table. The game was over. The checkmate was complete. All that was left now was the sweeping up of the remaining pieces. I sat in the sunroom listening to the absolute silence of my penthouse. The connection was severed, but in my mind I could perfectly envision the scene unfolding miles away in the Buckhead estate. I knew exactly what that dead silence on their end of the line looked like. Beatrice was undoubtedly staring at the darkened screen of her smartphone, her manicured hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the device. Jasmine, who had certainly been eavesdropping on the conversation, was standing paralyzed by the dining room table, the horrific reality of her impending poverty crashing down on her like a physical weight. The power dynamic had permanently, irreversibly shifted. For 2 years, the Caldwell family had operated under the supreme delusion that they were the untouchable royalty of Atlanta. They had treated me as a lucky commoner, a charity case allowed into their prestigious court solely because of my late husband. They genuinely believed my corporate consulting firm was just a cute little hobby, completely blind to the fact that I generated more revenue in a single quarter than their entire restaurant group did in a year. Now the illusion was shattered. The Caldwell matriarch was no longer the ruler of her domain. She was a tenant in default, and I held the eviction notice. My phone buzzed again, breaking my train of thought. It was Valerie. I answered, putting the call on speaker while I poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. They are in absolute chaotic despair, Valerie reported, her voice thick with dark amusement. The switchboard at my law firm is currently lighting up like a Christmas tree. Beatrice has called 7 times in the last 4 minutes. Jasmine is leaving frantic, screaming voicemails on the assistant line. They are demanding to speak with you. They are begging for a negotiation. Route every single one of their calls to the legal department voicemail, I instructed calmly. Do not let a single member of that family through to a human representative. They voted to ban me from their personal lives, so from this moment forward, they are nothing more than a hostile corporate entity. They will be treated exactly like a defaulting tenant. Understood, Valerie replied. Connor also attempted to reach out. He sent an email to our general inbox claiming he was coerced into signing the lease extension and threatening to report Apex Properties for predatory business practices. I let out a short, sharp laugh. Let him threaten us, I said. Send him a standardized automated reply acknowledging receipt of his message. Let him sit in his borrowed house and sweat. He is already facing the wrath of his mother-in-law for losing the business and the wrath of his wife for funding a mistress. By tomorrow morning, he will be the most hated man in the state of Georgia. The reality of their situation was a beautiful, inescapable trap. They had no cash reserves. Their credit was completely destroyed. The community they had relied on for social validation would instantly abandon them the moment the embezzlement scandal became public knowledge. Beatrice had spent her entire life judging other people for their financial struggles, preaching from her church pew about how poverty was a result of poor choices and a lack of faith. Now she was about to experience the terrifying freefall of absolute financial ruin, and she had no one to blame but herself and the son-in-law she had chosen over me. I walked over to the smart control panel on my wall and turned on a soft ambient jazz playlist. The smooth saxophone notes filled the penthouse, contrasting perfectly with the absolute devastation I had just unleashed upon my enemies. Over the next 48 hours, the Caldwell estate turned into a war zone. I did not need to be in the room to know they were tearing each other apart. Valerie kept me updated with brief clinical reports. Jasmine had reportedly thrown all of Connor's expensive clothes onto the front lawn, screaming at him in full view of the wealthy neighbors. Beatrice had tried to secure an emergency meeting with her bank manager, only to be politely but firmly escorted off the premises when her accounts flagged the massive debt-to-income ratio. They were drowning, and they were grabbing onto each other, pulling the entire family down into the deep, dark water. The ultimate realization had finally set in for Beatrice. She could not bully her way out of a legally binding commercial lease. She could not manipulate a bank into ignoring a $500,000 deficit. And most importantly, she could not intimidate the woman who held the deed to her legacy. I had stripped away every single weapon she possessed. I took her car, I took her restaurants, I took her pride. They were cornered animals backed into a wall entirely of their own making. And cornered animals always make one final desperate and remarkably stupid charge. They had exhausted the phone lines. They had failed at the banks. There was only one option left for them. They would have to leave the safety of their suburban mansion and come directly into my territory. They would have to face the executioner in person. I smiled, taking a sip of my sparkling water. The board was set for the final move. Let them come. It was precisely 10 in the morning on Thursday when the final act of their desperation played out. I was sitting at my desk in my corner office reviewing a merger acquisition file for a client when my intercom buzzed. My executive assistant, a highly trained professional who rarely showed any emotion, sounded genuinely alarmed. She informed me that 3 individuals were currently causing a massive scene in the reception area, demanding to see me immediately. They were threatening to call the police if security did not let them through. I did not need to ask for names. I pressed the intercom button and calmly instructed her to send them straight back. The heavy glass doors of my office violently swung open. Beatrice, Jasmine, and Connor stormed into my sanctuary. The contrast between my pristine temperature-controlled corporate environment and their absolute physical deterioration was jarring. Beatrice looked as if she had aged a decade in a matter of days. Her signature tailored burgundy dress was wrinkled, and her usually immaculate hair was visibly unkempt. Jasmine looked hollowed out, carrying the frantic, exhausted energy of a woman whose entire social reality had just collapsed overnight. But it was Connor who took the lead. He marched directly toward my custom oak desk, his face flushed a furious, blotchy red. He was operating on pure, unchecked arrogance. For his entire life, Connor had relied on his status as a white man in corporate spaces to intimidate his way out of consequences. He genuinely believed that if he raised his voice loud enough, threw around enough legal jargon, and postured aggressively, the black woman sitting across from him would naturally shrink back and submit to his authority. He slammed both of his hands flat against the polished surface of my desk. The loud smack echoed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but I did not even blink. "You think you are so smart," Maya Connor shouted, his voice cracking with artificial authority. "You think you can just orchestrate a hostile takeover of a family business and get away with it. We have spoken to actual lawyers. What you did was textbook entrapment. It is corporate fraud and it is highly illegal. You set up a shell company to trick this family into signing a predatory lease extension. That is extortion." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on my leather desk pad. I watched him spew his empty threats. "You purposely hid your identity as the landlord to entrap me into signing a document under false pretenses." Connor continued, leaning over my desk to invade my personal space. "You are going to reverse that eviction notice immediately. You are going to tear up that $500,000 demand letter, and you are going to transfer the deeds of those properties directly into a trust managed by me. If you do not do exactly what I say right now, I am going straight to the district attorney. I will personally see to it that you are indicted for corporate fraud. I will ruin your entire consulting firm. I will make sure you lose your license, your business, and your freedom." Behind him, Beatrice and Jasmine stood near the doorway, watching the spectacle with a mixture of desperate hope and sheer terror. They were actually relying on this man to save them. They were praying that his aggressive performative outrage would somehow intimidate me into surrendering my leverage. I let him scream. I let him empty his lungs and exhaust his entire vocabulary of borrowed legal terms. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my hand to stop him. I simply sat there, radiating absolute glacial calm. The power dynamic in the room was visually staggering. He was sweating frantic and losing control while I was wearing a bespoke silk suit, breathing evenly, and looking at him as if he were a minor accounting error that I was about to permanently delete from a spreadsheet. When Connor finally ran out of breath, he stood there panting, glaring down at me with an expression that demanded my immediate submission. He waited for me to apologize. He waited for me to scramble for my phone and call Valerie to cancel the demand letter. He waited for the fear to wash over my face. Instead, I reached across my desk and picked up a silver pen. I rolled it slowly between my fingers, studying the intricate engraving on the metal barrel. "Are you quite finished, Connor?" I asked. My voice was dangerously quiet, lacking any trace of intimidation or panic. "Do not use that condescending tone with me," he snapped back, though he visibly recoiled at my lack of fear. "I am giving you one chance to fix this before I destroy your life." I set the silver pen down. I looked past him, locking eyes with Beatrice, who was trembling by the door. She knew. She could see it in my posture. She knew that Connor's screaming had accomplished absolutely nothing, and that they had just walked directly into the final slaughterhouse. I returned my gaze to Connor. I looked at this pathetic, arrogant man who had stolen money from his own mother-in-law to buy designer bags for a mistress, all while lecturing me about toxic independence. He had relied on his privilege his entire life to shield him from accountability, and he was completely oblivious to the fact that his privilege held absolutely no currency in my office. "If you are quite done lecturing me on the intricacies of commercial real estate law," I said smoothly, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk, "then I suggest you take a very deep breath, because you are about to need it." I opened the lower right drawer of my custom oak desk with agonizing slowness. I did not break eye contact with Connor as my hand wrapped around a thick, heavy black folder. The room was so quiet that the simple sound of the drawer gliding on its metal tracks felt like a thunderclap. I lifted the folder and placed it flat on the desktop. With a single fluid motion, I slid it across the polished wood. The heavy file glided perfectly, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch from where Connor's trembling hands gripped the edge of my desk. "You want to talk about fraud, Connor?" I asked, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "Let us discuss corporate fraud. I highly recommend you open that file before you say another word." Connor stared down at the black cover. The arrogant fire in his eyes flickered and died instantly, replaced by a primal, suffocating dread. He knew what he had done in the dark, and he was suddenly terrified of what I had brought into the light. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely grasp the edge of the cardboard. He flipped the cover open. I watched the exact second his soul left his body. His eyes darted across the bold header of the forensic audit. I watched his pupils track the numbers, the highlighted routing codes, and the undeniable photographic evidence of his forged vendor invoices. The blotchy, furious red color that had painted his face just moments ago vanished entirely. He turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The progressive, intimidating executive routine was instantly vaporized. Standing in front of me was nothing more than a terrified thief who had just been caught red-handed. "What is it?" Jasmine demanded from the doorway, her voice sharp with rising panic. "Connor, what did she give you?" Connor could not answer. He tried to slam the folder shut, desperately attempting to hide the pages from his wife, but he was too slow. Jasmine closed the distance between the doorway and the desk in 3 frantic strides. She snatched the folder out from under his hands. "Take a very good look at your husband's generational wealth building, Jasmine," I instructed coolly, leaning back into my leather chair. Jasmine looked down at the documents. Her eyes scanned the meticulously highlighted transactions. I sat in silence and watched the devastating reality of her marriage shatter into a million jagged pieces. She read the offshore gambling transfers. She read the itemized lists of cash withdrawn directly from the restaurant floor safe. But the killing blow came when she reached the 3rd page. I watched her perfectly manicured finger trace the credit card receipts for a high-end condominium lease and luxury diamond purchases. She looked down at her own wrists bare of any new jewelry. The realization hit her with the physical force of a collapsing building. "Who is Chloe?" Jasmine whispered, her voice cracking, as she read the name listed on a wire transfer for a tropical vacation package. "Connor, who is Chloe?" Connor backed away from his wife, holding his hands up defensively. "Jasmine, sweetheart, you have to listen to me," he stammered, his voice pitching high with absolute cowardice. "This is a setup." Maya fabricated these documents. She hacked the accounts. It is a fake ledger designed to tear us apart. You cannot believe this. "I did not fabricate your signature on the lease for a midtown apartment, Connor," I interjected smoothly. "I did not fabricate the security camera footage from the bank showing you depositing cash into a secondary account. The forensic accounting firm I hired is recognized by the federal government. Their methodology is flawless. You stole $150,000 from your mother-in-law to fund a gambling addiction and a mistress." Jasmine let out a visceral, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman whose entire identity, social standing, and personal reality had just been violently incinerated. She threw the heavy folder directly at Connor's chest. The pages exploded across the room, scattering evidence of his infidelity and theft all over my pristine office floor. She lunged at him, hitting his chest with her fists, screaming at him for betraying her, for spending her family's money on another woman, for humiliating her in front of the very person she hated the most. Connor scrambled backward, trying to catch her wrists. "Maya, you have to stop this," he pleaded, looking at me with wild, desperate eyes. "We can fix this quietly. I will pay it back. I will set up a payment plan. Just keep this inside the family. You cannot release this information to the public. It will ruin the restaurant's reputation. It will destroy everything." "Pay it back," I repeated, raising a single eyebrow. "Pay it back with what, Connor? You do not have a job. You do not have assets. The restaurant chain you claim to manage is completely insolvent, primarily because you drained its operating capital. You have absolutely nothing of value to offer me." Connor swallowed hard, his chest heaving as he pushed a sobbing Jasmine away from him. "I will sign whatever you want," he begged, abandoning all of his previous posturing. "I will sign the restaurants over to you. I will give you full control. Just let me walk away. Just keep the audit between us. I am begging you." I rested my elbows on the desk, clasping my hands together. I looked at this pathetic man who had stood at a Thanksgiving table and confidently diagnosed my grief as toxic independence. I looked at the man who had ordered me to return a luxury vehicle he intended to claim for himself. You are fundamentally misunderstanding the timeline of this situation, Connor, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. You are standing in my office trying to negotiate a settlement that expired before you even woke up today. Connor froze. Jasmine stopped crying, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks, as a new wave of terror washed over the room. By the door, Beatrice gripped the doorframe, her eyes wide with mounting horror. What do you mean? Connor whispered, his voice trembling. I mean that I did not just print that folder to scare you, I explained, articulating every syllable with merciless clarity. I am a corporate crisis manager. I do not bluff, and I do not make empty threats. At exactly 8 o'clock this morning, a team of specialized couriers from my legal department hand-delivered fully certified unredacted copies of that entire forensic audit to 2 very specific locations. The silence in the office was so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. The first package was delivered directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I continued, You did not just steal from your mother-in-law, Connor. You committed wire fraud, and you failed to declare $150,000 of illicit income. The IRS does not care about your safe spaces or your healing journeys. They care about tax evasion, and they pursue it with extreme prejudice. Connor's knees physically buckled. He grabbed the back of a guest chair just to keep himself standing. The second package, I said, delivering the ultimate guillotine drop, was delivered to the white-collar crime unit of the Atlanta Police Department. They have the bank routing numbers, the forged vendor invoices, and the security footage. You are not just fired, Connor. You are legally finished. By the end of the week, your assets will be frozen. Your passports will be flagged. You are going to federal prison. Jasmine collapsed onto the floor. Her knees hit the carpet with a soft thud, and she buried her face in her hands, letting out a long, hollow wail of pure despair. She realized in that exact moment that her husband was not just a cheater. He was a convicted felon waiting to be arrested, and her life of luxury was completely over. She was going to be the wife of an inmate stripped of her wealth and paraded through the local news. Connor stood completely paralyzed. The reality of his absolute destruction crushed the breath out of his lungs. The man who had arrogantly threatened to have me indicted for fraud just 10 minutes ago was now staring at his own impending incarceration. Maya, please! Connor gasped, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. He was weeping openly now, the tears tracking through his carefully trimmed beard. You cannot do this. I will not survive in prison. You have to call them off. Tell them it was an internal accounting error. Tell them we handled it privately. Please, I am begging you on my life. Have mercy. I looked at his tear-stained face. I thought about how he had voted to erase me from the family. I thought about how he had weaponized my dead husband's memory. I am a crisis manager, Connor. I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or sympathy. My job is to fix problems. You were the problem. And I just fixed you. Connor backed away, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the room for an exit that did not exist. He stumbled into the leather guest chair and collapsed into it, putting his head between his knees as he began to hyperventilate. Jasmine remained on the floor, her cries turning into wet, pathetic hiccups as she rocked back and forth, mourning the sudden and violent death of her comfortable reality. The two of them were completely neutralized, shattered by the weight of their own criminal arrogance. That left only Beatrice. The Caldwell matriarch released her death grip on the doorframe. She took a slow, unsteady step into the center of my office. Her signature tailored dress, usually a symbol of her unyielding authority, now hung on her shaking frame like a discarded theatrical costume. She looked at Connor, then down at Jasmine, realizing that her entire support system had just been vaporized in under 5 minutes. She had walked into this building expecting to command a room, and instead she found herself standing in a corporate graveyard. She turned her eyes to me. The sheer arrogance that had defined her entire existence was completely gone. In its place was raw, unadulterated terror. She realized she was standing in the domain of an apex predator, and she was the last item on the menu. Beatrice took another step forward, and then her legs completely buckled. The woman who demanded everyone bow to her social standing physically collapsed. Her knees hit the thick carpet of my office with a heavy, dull thud. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, abandoning every ounce of her pristine church lady dignity until she reached the edge of my custom oak desk. She reached up her manicured fingers, gripping the edge of the wood as if it were a life raft in a violent storm. Maya. Beatrice choked out her voice, trembling so violently it was barely recognizable. I am begging you, on my knees before God. Do whatever you want with Connor. Let him go to federal prison. Let him rot there. He deserves it for what he did to my daughter. But please, please have mercy on me. Have mercy on the family name. It was a stunning display of self-preservation. She was offering her own son-in-law as a sacrificial lamb just to save her social standing. You cannot take Caldwell's heritage away from us. Beatrice wept, tears completely ruining her perfectly applied makeup. You cannot shut the doors. Marcus built that brand alongside his father. He poured his blood, sweat, and tears into those kitchens. It is his legacy. If you destroy the restaurants, you are destroying the very last thing Marcus left behind on this earth. She paused, taking a ragged, desperate breath, and then played her final, most manipulative card. Think of little Leo. Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. He is a Caldwell. You cannot take away his father's legacy. How will you look your own son in the eyes and tell him you destroyed his birthright just to punish me? You are a mother, Maya. I am begging you, mother to mother. Do not take my grandson's future away. The air in my office went absolutely freezing. I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. The sheer, unmitigated audacity required to weaponize my dead husband and my 8-year-old son to save her own skin was staggering. This was the exact same woman who just 1 week ago had screamed at my crying child and told him he was spoiled and disrespectful. This was the woman who had happily cast us out to protect her own ego. I stood up from my leather chair. I walked slowly around the edge of the desk until I was standing directly over her. I looked down at her tear-stained face, offering absolutely no comfort, no warmth, and no forgiveness. Do not ever put my son's name in your mouth again, I commanded. My voice was a lethal, quiet blade. Beatrice flinched, shrinking back against the carpet, but I did not stop. You want to talk about Marcus and his legacy? I asked, stepping closer so she was forced to look up at me. You do not care about his legacy. You rotted his legacy from the inside out. You took the thriving, respected business he spent his life building, and you turned it into a personal piggy bank for your vanity projects. You let a con artist drain the operating accounts so you could pretend you were a progressive modern matriarch. You neglected the infrastructure. You alienated the vendors. You traded the genuine quality Marcus built for cheap social status at your country club. Beatrice shook her head frantically, trying to deny the truth, but I talked right over her. You did not protect his legacy, Beatrice. You infected it. And if I leave those restaurants in your hands for one more day, there will be absolutely nothing left for Leo but debt scandal and a ruined family name. I crouched down slightly so I was at eye level with her. I wanted to make sure she heard every single syllable of her sentencing. I am not destroying Marcus's legacy. I told her, my eyes locking onto hers. I am rescuing it from you. Beatrice stopped crying. She stared at me, her chest heaving slowly, realizing that my plan was far more comprehensive and devastating than simple revenge. I was not just burning her empire to the ground. I was surgically extracting the valuable pieces and leaving her with the ashes. I am seizing all 3 restaurant locations, I explained methodically. I am legally changing the locks at midnight. I am liquidating every single tainted asset, paying off the honest vendors you neglected, and restructuring the entire corporate entity from the ground up. Every piece of valuable commercial real estate, every intellectual property right, and every functioning financial account is being transferred immediately. Transferred where Beatrice whispered, the absolute dread pooling in her eyes. Into an irrevocable, highly secured blind trust, I replied. A trust completely managed by my corporate legal team, and the sole exclusive beneficiary of that trust is Leo. The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face. He will inherit a clean, highly profitable real estate and corporate empire the day he turns 25, I continued. I am securing his generational wealth. I am protecting his birthright. And until that day comes, you, Jasmine, and everyone else who sat at that Thanksgiving table will have absolutely zero access to it. You will not see a single dime. You will not hold a single title. You are completely and permanently excised from his future. No, Beatrice gasped, reaching out to grab the hem of my suit pants. Maya, please, I have nothing else. I mortgaged my house to keep up appearances. Where will I go? How will I live? I stepped back smoothly, pulling my pant leg out of her desperate grasp. I stood up to my full height, looking down at the absolute wreckage of the Caldwell family hierarchy scattered across my office floor. The golden child was weeping on the carpet. The arrogant white savior was hyperventilating in a chair, and the tyrannical matriarch was begging for scraps. I suggest you learn how to budget, I said coldly, because as the sole owner of Apex Properties and the acting trustee of Leo's estate, I am delivering your final notice. You are officially evicted from all commercial properties. You are fired from the company my husband built. And you are permanently cut off from my finances. I turned my back on her and walked over to my office door. I opened it wide, gesturing toward the reception area where my private security team was already waiting in the hallway. Your safe space is officially closed, I announced, looking at all three of them. Get out of my office. The heavy glass doors of my office swung shut, sealing their fate with a definitive, quiet click. My private security detail stepped forward, flanking the three shattered remnants of the Caldwell dynasty. Connor did not put up a fight. He stumbled forward like a hollow shell, his eyes vacant, his mind already calculating how many years he would spend behind bars. Jasmine trailed behind him, weeping loudly into her hands, completely ignored by the corporate staff, who watched her humiliating exit from their desks. Beatrice was the last to cross the threshold. She moved with the slow, shuffling gait of a woman who had just been stripped of everything that made her feel alive. She did not look back. The fallout was swift, absolute, and entirely public. As a crisis manager, I know that the most effective cleanups leave absolutely no loose ends, and I made sure every single thread of their corruption was pulled. The Atlanta Police Department and the Internal Revenue Service did not waste time. Just 2 days later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the early morning fog outside the luxury midtown condominium Connor had leased for his mistress. I watched the live news broadcast from the comfort of my kitchen island. Connor was marched out through the lobby doors in handcuffs. He was wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt from my office, looking disheveled, terrified, and incredibly small. News cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing the exact moment his progressive, untouchable facade crumbled into federal charges. There was no family money to post his bail. There was no high-priced defense attorney waiting to spin the narrative. He was processed, charged with multiple counts of wire fraud and tax evasion, and left to rot in a holding cell. Jasmine filed for divorce the very next day, a desperate and completely futile attempt to distance herself from the financial wreckage. But without my hidden financial interventions to prop her up, her reality crashed down with brutal velocity. The luxury sport utility vehicle was gone. The penthouse was seized by creditors. The platinum credit cards were canceled. Stripped of her unearned wealth and her fabricated social media influence, she was forced to face the real world. A few weeks later, my assistant discreetly verified her new employment status. Jasmine, the woman who had sneered at my career and flaunted her fake luxury lifestyle, was now working the closing shift at a local greasy spoon diner on the outskirts of the city. She wore a stiff polyester uniform that smelled permanently of old fryer oil. She spent her nights wiping down sticky laminate tables and being berated by impatient customers for forgetting their extra napkins. Her manicured acrylic nails were chipped and broken. Her 50,000 social media followers had abandoned her the second the money dried up and the scandal broke. But the most poetic justice was reserved for Beatrice. The bank moved aggressively on the heavily mortgaged Buckhead estate. The imposing iron gates that had once protected her safe space were locked by the state. I drove past the property once just to see the bright yellow foreclosure sign planted directly in front of her beloved pristine rose bushes. Stripped of her mansion and her restaurant empire, Beatrice was forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a decaying building complex. The walls were thin, the appliances were ancient, and the oppressive heat of the Atlanta summer leaked through the drafty windows. The true punishment for Beatrice, however, was not the poverty. It was the absolute social death. She attended her megachurch the following Sunday, clinging to the desperate hope that she could play the victim one last time. But the news of the embezzlement, the fraud, and the eviction had already swept through the congregation like wildfire. When she walked down the center aisle, the very people she had spent decades judging and manipulating simply turned their backs. The pastor looked the other way. The choir members refused to meet her eyes. The pew where she had held court for 20 years was suddenly entirely empty. She sat alone, surrounded by the deafening, icy judgment of her peers. She had been excommunicated from the only world that mattered to her. While they sank into the abyss of their own making, I executed the restructuring of Marcus's legacy. Apex Properties legally seized all 3 restaurant locations. The old tarnished Caldwell's Heritage signs were torn down and replaced with sleek, modernized branding. I cleared the bad debts, paid the honest vendors they had neglected, and placed every single appreciating asset into a heavily guarded, ironclad blind trust. The trust was entirely insulated from any external claims bearing a single indisputable beneficiary name: Leo. 6 months after the Thanksgiving dinner that started it all, the dust had completely settled. The air in Atlanta felt different to me now. It was clean, breathable, and entirely mine. I sat in a curved leather booth at one of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants in the city. The ambient lighting cast a warm golden glow over the crisp white tablecloth. Soft rhythmic jazz played through the hidden speakers, setting a perfectly tranquil mood. I wore a tailored emerald silk dress, a delicate diamond pendant resting against my collarbone. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of a vintage Bordeaux. Across the table sat Leo. He was dressed in a sharp little blazer, his eyes bright and full of genuine, unrestrained joy. He was laughing at a joke the waiter had just told him while slicing into an extravagant chocolate dessert. There was no fear in his eyes anymore. There was no anxiety, no toxic pressure, and no grandmother waiting to snap at him for simply existing. He was safe, he was loved, and his future was legally secured by an empire that could never be touched by the hands of greedy relatives. I reached across the table and gently wiped a smudge of chocolate from his chin. I smiled at him, a real warm, fiercely protective smile. He smiled back, taking another eager bite of his dessert. I leaned back into the plush leather of the booth. The camera begins a slow, deliberate pull-out, widening the frame to capture the absolute serenity and power of the moment. I slowly turn my head, shifting my gaze away from my son, and look directly into the lens. The warm restaurant lighting catches the sharp, unwavering focus in my eyes. They voted to ban me from the family, so I bought the family and I evicted them. Respect is not requested, it is collected. The screen holds on my perfectly calm, victorious expression for one final silent second. Fade to black.